Welcome back to the class video for Module 8, in which we're looking at two of the revolutionary state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation. In the first part of the module, we gave these documents some historical context by looking at the evolution of the colonial charters and the structures of the colonial governments. As we turn now to the text here in the second portion, we need to adopt a little bit different strategy for reading these texts than the ones we've read so far in the course, because of course these are very different kinds of documents. These constitutions and the articles do not have a kind of narrative structure to them. They're not making an argument or telling a story in the way that the previous documents were. They're more like organizational charts, right, that are sort of infused with philosophical proclamations about liberty and freedom, but nevertheless they're to be read as conveying an organizational structure and the power relationships or mutual responsibilities of the different parts of the organization. So for that reason, we're not going to try to read them from beginning to end in succession. Instead, we'll take a kind of checkerboard approach to these and pull out key articles and sections from each and set them up in comparison to each other. And we want to take this checkerboard approach in kind of two stages. First, we're going to compare the New York and Pennsylvania constitutions as state constitutions, and then we'll turn and look at the Articles of Confederation as a national organization. Turning then to the comparison of the New York and Pennsylvania constitutions, we again want to think about a kind of two-part analysis. The primary and overriding main idea that you should get out of these documents is an understanding of the way in which they conceive of government as being organized around two branches, right? Not three branches, two branches, the legislative branch and the executive branch. And furthermore, that these branches are not co-equal. They are not checking and balancing each other. They're not independent branches. Rather, the legislative branch is clearly and unquestionably dominant over the executive branch. The executive branch is clearly subordinate to the legislative branch. The executive is the servant of the legislature. We want to see that structure in both of these documents and then to consider a kind of miscellany of other themes that either set up or illustrate that core division or set up our discussion of the Articles of Confederation and then the turn to the federal Constitution. The place to begin is the foundational principle for both documents, or the activating principle of sovereignty in both documents, and that's the principle of popular sovereignty, or the sovereignty of the people. Doesn't necessarily mean that the sovereignty is popular, right? That people like it. It means the sovereignty of the people, the people's sovereignty. So let's do a quick sketch first of New York and then of Pennsylvania, of looking for that principle of popular sovereignty and then understanding how the legislative and executive branches, as they are described, flow from that principle. We can begin in the New York Constitution in the very first article. So the New York Constitution lays out this relationship very clearly. We see in Article 1, the Constitution declares, "This convention, therefore, in the name and by the authority of the good people of the state, doth ordain, determine, and declare that no authority shall, on any pretense whatever, be exercised over the people or members of the state, but such as shall be derived from and granted by them." So that authority of the good people of the state is the basis of popular sovereignty, right? So the first declared principle in the New York Constitution. And then in the second article, the first fundamental act of the people is to create the legislative power. Article 2 reads, "This convention doth further, in the name and by the authority of the good people of this state, ordain, determine, and declare that The supreme legislative power within the state shall be vested in two separate and distinct bodies of men, the one to be called the Assembly of the State of New York, the other to be called the Senate of the State of New York. So there we have the legislative power embodied in these two separate institutions. We call this bicameralism, for two houses of the legislature. And before we dig into the details of the legislature, just note then that you have to come all the way down. Now this is a highly edited version of the New York Constitution, but even here you have to come all the way down to Article 17 before there's a mention of the executive power. Article 17 at the bottom of the right-hand column of page 4 reads, "And this convention doth further in the name and by the authority of the good people of this state ordain, determine, and declare that the supreme executive power and authority of this state shall be vested in a governor." And then we have to come all the way down to the very last of the articles included in this edited version, all the way down to Article 40, before we get any mention of courts. Article 40 reads, "And this convention doth further ordain, determine, and declare in the name of the authority of the good people of the state, trial by jury shall be established and remain inviolate, that no acts of attainder shall be passed by the legislature, and further, that the legislature of the state shall at no time hereafter institute any new court or courts, but such as shall proceed according to the course of the common law." So the judiciary is really an afterthought here. They don't get to it except down in the details, and there's nothing about this description of the judiciary that suggests it's a fully co-equal branch checking and balancing the other branches. What we have is one primary branch, the legislative branch, and all the other offices of government are in some way dependent on or derivative of that primary branch. So let's look now back on page 2 at the constitution or the construction of these two houses of the legislative branch. In Article 4, we get a description of the assembly on the right-hand column of page 2, that the assembly shall consist of at least 70 members to be annually chosen in the several counties in the following proportions. And then this key feature here in Article 5, that as soon after the expiration of 7 years subsequent to the termination of the present war, as may be, a census of the electors and inhabitants of the state may be taken under the direction of the legislature. Now, this is a radical and revolutionary proposition, this idea of a census. We are, of course, accustomed to the idea of a census every 10 years because it is embodied in our federal constitution, and we have been doing censuses every 10 years since the United States was established. But there's utterly nothing like this in European history preceding this. This is a revolutionary and new idea. The elections for Parliament in Great Britain, or the colonial elections for the colonial assemblies, were not based on a head count and a distribution of sort of voting districts so that each district has roughly the same number of people in it, and therefore each voter has roughly the same influence on the outcome of election. Consider the following hypothetical. You have two voting districts, and they each get to elect one member to the legislature. One voting district has 100 people in it, and another voting district has 1,000 people in it. Well, if those 100 people get to elect one representative, and those 1,000 people get to elect one representative, the people living in the district with 100 people in it have 10 times more voting power than the people who live in a district with 1,000 people in it. And it's that principle of roughly equal distribution of voting power, something approximating one person, one vote, each vote counts equal, that necessitates the invention of the census. Here in the New York Constitution, every 7 years, we're going to count up all the people in the state, and then we're going to rejigger the voting districts, reapportion them so that they're roughly equal. Now, not everyone gets to vote, Voting qualifications in this Constitution are different for the Assembly as opposed to the Senate. So if we come down to Article 7 at the bottom of the left-hand column, page 3, we'll get the voting requirements for the Assembly. Article 7 reads, that every male inhabitant of full age who shall have personally resided within one of the counties of this state for 6 months immediately preceding the day of election shall, at such election, be entitled to vote for representatives of the said county and assembly if, during the time aforesaid, he shall have been a freeholder possessing a freehold of the value of 20 pounds within the said county, or have rented a tenement therein for the yearly value of 40 shillings and been rated and actually paid taxes to the state. Now, this contains some somewhat technical legal language, possessing a freehold or being a freeholder as opposed to renting a tenement. So renting makes perfect sense in our 21st century vocabulary, but the idea of possessing a freehold is a little bit pre-modern. So a freeholder is someone who owns their property outright. That is to say, you own the full title to your land. You don't rent it from anyone else. That's renting a tenement. But also you don't say in our modern mortgage system, the bank really owns your house, and then you have a legal right to occupy it by virtue of you paying the bank your mortgage payments every month. There's really almost nothing like that in the 18th century. So the normal kind of customary way of having land ownership is to own your property outright. And that's what being a freeholder is. Now, a freehold of the value of 20 pounds is not a particularly large freehold in 18th century terms. It'd be very different from colony to colony, but probably a 20-pound freehold, that is English sterling pounds, so something like $20, right? It'd be much more than that in today's money. But probably something like a family cabin on 40 acres out in the Pioneer with your garden and some cash crops and raising some cows and sheep and whatnot. That is not a small hovel, probably would not qualify for a 20-pound freehold, but you certainly do not have to have a mansion or a plantation house of any scale to qualify to be worth 20 pounds. And similarly for a tenement rented at the value of 40 shillings, probably something like a normal family household is the target level here that they're trying to qualify. So, those people who own land that's valued at 20 pounds sterling, or who rent a chunk of land on which they pay at least 40 shillings a year rent, those people have the right to vote for the members of the House of, for the Assembly. Now notice the different voting qualifications to vote for members of the Senate. If we jump down in the right-hand column of page 3 to Article 10, we see the description of the Senate. And this convention doth further in the name and by the authority of the good people of this state ordain, determine, and declare that the Senate of the state of New York shall consist of 24 freeholders to be chosen out of the body of freeholders, and that they be chosen by the freeholders of this state possessed of freeholds of the value of 100 pounds over and above all debts charged thereon. So a substantially larger requirement in order to vote for senators, right? Whereas to vote for representatives in the House in the Assembly, you have to have a freehold valued at 20 pounds. In order to vote for members of the Senate, you have to possess a freehold valued at 100 pounds, so 5 times greater, and no form of renting can qualify you for the right to vote. So we see here one of the primary constraints on, or conditions placed on, that principle that we read in Tom Paine's Common Sense, that all men have a natural right to participate in that first government, right? If you remember Paine's description of a simple direct democracy, of a natural government, he declared all men have a right to participate. He did not say or suggest only those men with some property, right? Only those men who determined certain qualifications should get to vote. He declared all men. And yet here we have in the New York Constitution this threshold of property ownership. And further, a distinction between these two bodies of the legislature. That is to say, the assembly is clearly intended to be the popular house, the most egalitarian house. Therefore, the voting requirements are lower, but not down to zero. The Senate is intended to be the upper house, or the more aristocratic house, and therefore the voting requirements are higher, indeed 5 times higher. You must possess a freehold to the value of 100 pounds. The Senate is going to further be distanced from, or cushioned from, insulated from the demands of the people by being elected for 4 years and then being divided into 4 separate classes, so that we're electing 1/4 of the Senate each year. You're familiar with that rotational structure from our current federal Senate, where senators serve for 6 years, and every 2 years we elect 1/3 of them. A similar idea here, simply on a 4-year plan and dividing them into 4 classes. The idea behind rotation is that the members of the Senate, the senators, are more secured from, or more insulated from, popular pressures, right? The kind of vagaries and winds of change, the fickle desires of the masses. In the House, in the Assembly, the people can vote out the bums any given year and vote in a whole new crew and get exactly what they want instantaneously. With the Senate, there's a buffer between the people's desires and their ability to change the Senate. They can only change 1/4 of the Senate each year, so it creates a staggered effect, a delayed effect. If there's some great political issue that sweeps through the public and they want instantaneous change, they cannot have it instantaneously. They can do so with the Assembly within 1 year, but they have to slowly change this composition of the Senate over time, which creates a resistance then to popular pressure. The last piece then here is to add in the executive and see how it fits. If we come down to Article 17, declares that the supreme executive power and authority of the state shall be vested in the governor, and that statedly once in every 3 years, and as often as the seat of government shall become vacant, a wise and discreet freeholder of the state shall be by ballot elected governor by the freeholders of the state qualified as before described to elect senators. So we have these 2 standards of voting credential, a lower one and a higher one. The higher standard is necessary to vote for governor. The governor will serve for 3 years unless they're removed from office. And look here in 18 and 19 at the governor's powers, right? In Article 18, governor continues in office for 3 years. He is the commander-in-chief of the militia and the admiral of the navy. That he has the power to convene the Senate and Assembly on extraordinary occasions, to prorogue them, that is, to send them home, to grant reprieves and pardons to persons convicted of crimes, to inform the legislature on the condition of the state, now down in Article 19, to correspond with the other states and with the Continental Congress, to transact necessary business with the officers of the government, etc. These are relatively minor powers. Certainly being commander-in-chief of the state militia is a great and august power that belongs to the executive. But these other things corresponding to states, granting reprieves and pardons to convicts, proroguing the assembly in extraordinary circumstances, these are relatively minor executive powers. And the great power that is not listed here that we're accustomed to from the federal model, we see no role here for the governor in the passing of legislation. And to see that, let's come back to Articles 2 and 3, back on page 2. The federal model that we're used to, of course, is the House of Representatives passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, and then it has to go to the president for their signature. That bill does not become a law without the approval of the president. In Article 2 here, back on page 2, the significance of this phrase, that the supreme legislative power within the state is vested in these two bodies of men, excluding the governor, means that all legislative power, all the power necessary to create a law, is embodied in the legislature. The legislature is not dependent on the executive to create a law. In place of the presidential veto process that we're used to, the New York Constitution creates this council to revise bills, and we see that in Article 3. Article 3 reads, "And whereas laws inconsistent with the spirit of this Constitution or with the public good may be hastily and unadvisedly passed, be it ordained that the governor for the time being, the chancellor, and the judges of the Supreme Court, or any two of them together with the governor, shall be and hereby are constituted a council to revise all bills about to be passed into law by the legislature." So the governor cannot act alone. The governor can join the Supreme Court, and the chancellor is sort of like the treasurer of the state. That word chancellor is a fancy old label for what we would call treasurer. So the governor, the treasurer, and the judges of the Supreme Court all together formed this council. Their approval is not necessary. If they say nothing, if they do nothing, the bill becomes a law. They may choose to intervene and to write out their objections and to send the law back to the legislature. The legislature can override their concerns, their veto, with a 2/3 vote. So functionally similar to our presidential veto in our federal model, but notably and significantly, the governor cannot act on their own. Right? The executive does not have that independent power. It's only with the executive joining with the Supreme Court, and together a majority of them can intervene and review the acts of legislation. We call this power, or this process of reviewing laws or reviewing bills passed by the legislature in order to determine whether they should be permitted to become laws, we call that process judicial review. And so we see the judicial review built into the New York Constitution here in Article 3. So let's just take a moment then to look back at our illustration and to summarize these relationships before we turn to the Pennsylvania model. So we can see here in the bottom half of this illustration an attempt to schematize this set of relationships between the Assembly, the Senate, and the governor in New York. The Assembly and the Senate together comprise the legislative branch, and they contain, as we've just noted, supreme legislative authority. The Assembly has many more members. It has to have at least 70. The Senate is capped at 24. The Assembly is elected every single year. Every member of the of the Assembly is elected, and they are elected by a lower voting qualification than the Senate. The Senate is elected 1/4 of them every year for 4-year terms with a higher voting qualification as property qualification to vote. But both are distributed roughly equally by county in proportion to the number of electors based on a every 7-year census. The governor, on the other hand, is elected by freeholders for a 3-year term but has comparatively minor powers. The Pennsylvania Constitution is not nearly so neatly organized for us to walk through this assembly. The pieces of this are buried in different places. The Pennsylvania Constitution also, as you've noted, has a fairly long preamble and a pretty long Bill of Rights that precede even the frame of government. So let's turn now to the Pennsylvania Constitution and see if we can pick apart comparable clauses to see the structure of that government. As we turn to the Pennsylvania Constitution, then we see a little bit more complicated organization. We've got this long preamble at the start, this little essay on the nature of government, and then we move into a Declaration of Rights, or a Bill of Rights, if you will. If we pause on Article 4 in the Bill of Rights, we find this principle of popular sovereignty. Article 4 reads, that all power being originally inherent in and consequently derived from the people, therefore all officers of government, whether legislative or executive, are their trustees and servants, and at all times accountable to them. Again, that same principle that sovereignty derives from the people. If we get to the end, we'll come back to the Bill of Rights here after we finish the looking at the construction of the primary branches. Then if we come all the way down to, I guess this is page 3. No page numbers on this edition. And we look at the plan or frame of government for the Commonwealth or state of Pennsylvania. We see in section 2, 3, and 4 this trilogy that we're familiar with, legislative, executive, and judicial, except we see that the courts are clearly treated as a kind of afterthought or as a third thing, not the equivalent of the first two. Section 2 reads, the supreme legislative power shall be vested in a House of Representatives of the freemen of the Commonwealth or state of Pennsylvania. Section 3 says, the supreme executive power shall be vested in a president and council. And Section 4 says, courts of justice shall be established in the city of Philadelphia and in every county of the state. And you can see the difference in that phrasing, that they're kind of got one foot in, one foot out of moving to this new trilogy. They're accustomed to one, few, and many. We know we're going to end up in another decade or 15 years after this, executive, legislative, judicial. The Pennsylvania Constitution almost recognizes the courts as clearly a third thing, yet they have no interaction with the other two branches, as we'll see in the body of the document. If we focus on the legislative and the executive branches, then we see two big differences between this Constitution and the New York Constitution. Of course, the thing for which the Pennsylvania Constitution is most famous is creating a single house of the legislature, that is, a unicameral legislature. In Module 9, in the next set of readings, John Adams is going to be primarily focused on whether this is a wise idea, whether one house or two houses of the legislature is smarter. He is much in favor of two houses of the legislature, as we'll see in the next module. But the single house of the legislature is the most characteristic feature of the Pennsylvania Constitution. Before the Constitution describes the powers of that house, though, it sets out the voting credentials for all voters for every office. In Section 6, on the right-hand column here, the Constitution reads, every freeman of the full age of 21 years, having resided in this state for the space of 1 whole year next before the day of elections for representatives, and paid public taxes during that time, shall enjoy the right of an elector. So we notice immediately how different this standard of voting is than New York standard. First, there is only one standard here. There is one qualification to become a voter in the state of Pennsylvania, not, as we just saw, two different standards as in New York, depending on what you're voting for. So that is dramatically more egalitarian. And notice that there is no mention of how much land you should have to own. You have to have been a resident for 1 year, and the key phrase here is, and paid public taxes during that time. So if you paid any form of tax, whether you're a landowner, whether, say, you went to the county park to play Frisbee on a Friday afternoon and you had to pay your parking fee to get through the gate and to park in the parking lot, hold on to that receipt for having paid that parking fee. That's a public tax. Any form of public tax qualifies you as a voter in Pennsylvania. So this is a dramatically lower qualification for voting, and indeed it is the lowest qualification for voting of any of the new states. This is radically egalitarian in terms of the last quarter of the 18th century. Now, whereas the New York Constitution had these two different staggered terms, elections every year for the Assembly in New York and every 4 years for the Senate of New York, here in Pennsylvania, every office is going to be elected every single year. If we jump ahead to Section 9, the members of the House of Representatives shall be chosen annually by ballot by the freemen of this Commonwealth. And again, we're going to conduct a census in order to evenly distribute the voting districts. If we look in Section 17, but as representation in proportion to the number of taxable inhabitants is the only principle which can at all times secure liberty and make the voice of a majority of the people the law of the land, therefore The General Assembly shall cause complete lists of the untaxable inhabitants to be taken for the last meeting, and which representation shall continue for the next 7 years afterwards, at the end of which a new return of the taxable inhabitants shall be made, and a representation thereto agreeable thereto appointed by the said assembly, and so on septennially forever. So there you have every 7 years we're going to conduct a census of all the taxable inhabitants, and we will redraw the voting districts to make them proportional. Now, if the first and kind of most notorious difference or distinction of the Pennsylvania Constitution is this singular house of the legislature, it is also dramatically different than the New York Constitution in creating a plural executive. If you recall, the New York Constitution called for a single governor to be elected every 3 years, but gave that governor relatively minor powers. Here, we're going to create a plural executive and then out a plural executive council, and from that council, we'll choose a president and a vice president here in Section 19. For the present, the Supreme Executive Council of the state shall consist of 12 persons chosen in the following manner, and they distribute the voting. If you come down about 2/3 of the way down, by this mode of election and continual rotation, more men will be trained to public business. There will in every subsequent year be found in the council a number of persons acquainted with the proceedings of the foregoing years, etc., whereby the business will be more consistently conducted. The president and the vice president then are chosen at the top of the right-hand column annually by the joint ballot of the General Assembly and Council of the members of the council. So the public gets to elect the council. Once the council is seated, nominations from the members of the council for president and vice president are tendered, and then all the members of the assembly and all the members of the council, presumably those who are not nominated, would then get to choose the president and the vice president. Every year, we're going to choose a new president and vice president of the council, so it'll be continually rotating. And then the powers to be exercised by this council can only be exercised in the collective or in the plurality in Section 20. The president, and in his absence, the vice president with the council, 5 of whom shall be a quorum, shall have a power to, and then this list of powers. So the president cannot act on his own. The president can only activate executive powers with a majority of the council supporting him. Now, if we look at the executive powers, we'll find virtually the same powers that were conferred in the New York Constitution. The power to make appointments, the power to be commander-in-chief of the militia, the power to hear impeachment, the power to grant pardons and remit fines, etc. These are, in the scale of governmental powers, comparatively minor. Again, what we don't find in the Pennsylvania Constitution is any specific role for the executive in creating legislation. Indeed, all the way back at the end in Section 47, buried at the very end of the Constitution, we find an institution that is similar to the Council of Revisers or Council of Revisions that we saw in the New York Constitution. We find a Council of Censors here in Section 47 in the Pennsylvania Constitution. Section 47 reads, "In order that the freedom of the Commonwealth may be preserved inviolate forever, there shall be chosen by ballot by the freemen in each city and county respectively in the second Tuesday, blah, 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 and every 7th year, 2 persons in each city and county of the state to be called the Council of Censors, who shall meet together on the second Monday of the next ensuing, the majority of whom shall be a quorum." They're going to meet every 7 years, and they are going to review every piece of legislation passed by the legislature in the previous 7 years. Any laws that they find unconstitutional or violating the people's fundamental liberties, they simply get to declare null and void. Now you can imagine going 7 years thinking that a law is in effect, everybody obeying the law, economic market institutions growing up around accepting this law, this principle, and then 7 years later you find out, That law doesn't exist. That law violates the Constitution. The key thing, of course, is that the executive then has no role in creating or reviewing legislation. So let's return now to our illustration. If we step back then and put all the pieces together visually, we can ask the question, how far have these constitutions moved from the Aristotelian model of one, few, and many? And we can measure the impact then of social contract theory or theory of democratic revolution upon classical constitutional science. They cannot completely abandon this framework. There is a kind of correspondence. Certainly the many are well represented here, right? The question really is what happens to the few and the one. Those are the most antithetical elements of the British Constitution. If you remember from Paine, it was the monarchical tyranny and the aristocratic tyranny and the king and the lords, and then those nascent republican materials that he saw in the House of Commons. So the many are well represented. What's the fate of the one and the few? There's a kind of inescapability of the one in the form of the executive. If you recall back, both Locke and Rousseau recognized that there were these two core functions of government, one the legislative, one the executive. They have a little bit different explanations of where those rights come from. If you recall from Locke, you have the right in the state of nature to determine what's best for yourself, and you surrender and turn that over to society at the social contract. That becomes the foundation of the legislative power. You also have a right in the state of nature to execute and enforce the law of nature. You also surrender that at the social contract, and that becomes the foundation of government's executive power. So that was Locke's explanation. Rousseau's explanation was just a little bit different. He thinks of the government as an entity, right, as a single corporate body, and every body needs to have these two impulses. One impulse or a capability to decide what you want to do, and another impulse or capability to actually implement or act out what you want to do. And for Rousseau then, there's an intrinsic logic. Every body that exists in the world, everything with a will in the world, must have these two things as part of their makeup. But for both Locke and Rousseau, these were the irreducible elements of government. You had to have a legislative and you had to have an executive. Well, there is, of course, a kind of correspondence between the one and the executive insofar, well, especially if, as in the case of New York, you have a single person occupying the executive office. But even in the case of the plural executive in Pennsylvania, the idea that the executor can't be held back by procedure and the mechanics of holding debates. If you recall Rousseau, the great advantage of the rule of the one is that they are the most efficient and the most powerful form of government. So that idea, that the analogy, if you will, between the Aristotelian one embodied in monarchy and a kind of one embodied in the executive impulse is evident here. They can't completely escape the idea of the one, but they have done everything they can to beat up the one and make it subordinate to the legislative power, to reduce its significance and to put it under the control of the primary branch, the legislative branch here. The many is also a tricky concept for these state constitutions. We notice that the Pennsylvania Constitution entirely obliterates the idea of the many, but the New York Constitution can't quite get rid of it, and indeed the New York Constitution is much more representative of the other state constitutions. So this division between between many and few is sort of encoded in the distinction between the Assembly and the Senate in the New York Constitution. Because the voting qualifications for the Assembly are lower, that is, relatively poorer people will get to vote for members of the Assembly than get to vote for the Senate. There is and also that the Assembly has many more members and the Senate has fewer, etc. There's a kind of distinction there between the many and the few. The popular house of the legislature represents the many. The upper house or the elite house of the legislature represents the few. And that is a modal difference between these two constitutions. No other state is able to go as far as Pennsylvania in entirely eliminating the idea of the few. That will be the central subject of John Adams's essay, whether we need to have an institution to house the few, the elite. And Adams is going to very much think, yes, that is necessary. But you can see in the difference between these two state constitutions kind of the limits of their democratic radicalism. Pennsylvania comes out much more egalitarian, much more radically democratic than any other state, exactly because it not only goes to war against the principle of the one by embodying the executive in a plural office, but also in eliminating the idea of the few. Again, most states are going to replicate the few and the many in the two different branches of the legislature. But above all, these constitutions are not mixed. That is, we don't find the power of one branch dependent on the approval or the review of another branch. They are independent branches, and the legislature is clearly dominant. That's the core idea to get out of these state constitutions. We have a couple of more themes that we need to recognize in the Pennsylvania and state and New York Constitution that will help set us up for our discussion of the Articles of Confederation and the turn to a federal constitution. So let's leave this session of class here, and we'll pick up with the next session some kind of odds and ends themes in these state constitutions, and then we'll turn to the Articles of Confederation.